there. Thank you for joining me on Revise the Right Way with Mr. Bell as we are looking today at Persepolis and Marjani's journey. Like the Lion King, the circle of life, we're going to look at the way in which it's cyclical and things that happen early on come back to us later in the text. And so you can see on the right, we're looking at recurring imagery, and in particular, this word recurring, which means repeating, and it's just a very fancy way of saying an event that repeats itself over and over again. And so we have a recurring theme or a recurring motif or a recurring symbol, and that's what we're going to get here. Things that we have earlier on and things that we come back to. So we're going to jump straight actually to the end, and throughout this I've just put the chapter title, and it is called The End. Okay, and in this chapter we get this quote where she says that she filled her lungs with that very special air that doesn't exist anywhere else. Now, the whole point of this, and the reason why I'm starting here, is it is the end, and therefore she's reflecting back on her relationships, on certain ideas, and so this is very much about her relationship with her grandmother. She is filling her lungs both metaphorically and literally, okay, with those memories of her grandmother, who she knows she is never going to see again when she leaves. Okay, so you got in this panel, very interestingly, a lot of similarities, and I've just highlighted or I've suggested that some of the similarities perhaps are the physical similarities, the spiritual similarities, and ideological. So early on, she tells her grandmother that she's going to be the prophet, and her grandmother says, "Great," because she says she's going to help look after the elderly. Well, here you see that they look similar, and therefore it's like foreshadowing what Marjani is eventually going to turn into. Maybe she's a little bit more of a free spirit, her hair is slightly more out of her veil, but you can see that a lot of their ideas are similar. And it's as though they're facing the wind, maybe that's facing the pressure and the fights that they've had against the regime throughout the entire text. So I think when you look at this, it's one of those really interesting relationships which develops, and what I'm really interested in is for you at this point to try and come up with why you think, and I'm not giving you all the answers here, but I'm basically saying here's the end, go back to the beginning. How significant is her relationship to her throughout the entire text? Why does she hold her grandmother in such high esteem? Why does she put her almost on a pedestal? I'd like you to have a go at answering that question, and you can post it down below, or if you're in my class, you can post it into the appropriate place. And then once you've done that, we're going to move on to a different character. Similar idea. Okay, so still the same chapter with the end, and I've also put in one from Moscow here. So we have Anoush, and you can see that the whole idea of these quotes is about memory, is about forgiveness, and is about respect. So it's the idea of saying, don't worry, if I'll never forget when he says that she must not lose the family memory, and then she goes back and gives him his word to try to remain as honest as possible. There's a very cathartic element of this where she's basically reflecting on her own mistakes at this point, and what she herself has said. She did an interview with Emma Watson for Vogue magazine, and you can see that she said, I realized when I started writing this book that I was full of so much hate and anger I wanted to kill everyone. And then she goes on to say, if we start playing the same game as the people whom we accuse, that is very dangerous. And the reason why I want to look at Anoush is he has this impact on her, and I'm really curious what you think, what the impact is on Anoush, who dies early on her future. How does the way that he acts, how does the way that he presents himself change or influence how she lives her life? And when she finds out that he dies or he's killed, in the chapter The Sheep, I've highlighted a few areas that you might want to start thinking about. Eye positioning, the direction that their eyes are looking, is really important in a graphic novel like this, because here you can't see their eyes, they're not looking directly at us, they're avoiding our gaze, but they're also, for Anoush, looking down as if he is aware of what is going to happen. There's an inevitability. and Marjani's looking up, which could be a kind of nod towards she's looking up towards God or spiritual influence. Neither of them are looking straight at the reader, and in some ways that's maybe avoiding the obvious, because each panel, the phrase "everything will be alright" is repeated. So we have the repetition of the language, we have the repetition of certain patterns and symbols. So we have things like this, the bread swans, and we have the pattern on his clothing, which starts as almost like a checkerboard, but it's suggesting perhaps that he's being imprisoned, and then the foreboding, the foreshadowing with his black outfit, he's ready. It's signifying death. But then on her pajamas, you've also got this downward triangle. Perhaps it's sort of like a very simplistic way of saying that things are going to descend and get worse from this point. And obviously, in Persepolis, when people go down, like downstairs, it usually signifies something negative. So this exploration of symbols, and I've put semiotics, which is just the study of symbols, but it makes you sound smart in an exam, so use it, is really interesting. And I've also tied in this idea of Anoush's hair. So what's interesting here is we have no mouth. He just has his mustache, and the mustache is there because in this regime, hair is equated to power. So if you have a lot of hair, quite often that's to do with being powerful, but that hair speaks for you. There's various panels you can find where you can't see their mouth, but you can see the hair, as if it's like this signification that they either don't have a voice and they're being marginalized, or that their hair is speaking for them. And hopefully you pick up on the fact that Anoush's hair also looks like the hair in which she traps lots of her thoughts, and then there's that kind of cyclical element to that as well. Okay, so what's interesting about this next comparison, and I've deliberately put them next to each other because A, they fit, and B, you can see very, very easily, it's like one of those spot the difference puzzles, and you can see hopefully that there is so much that is similar in these two images, and there are obviously, well, I think the similarities make it really obvious to see the differences. One thing I'd say is, rather than just focusing on the main characters, look at the minor characters in the background. We have an almost exact replication of all of these characters, except some of them who were looking at the mother are now not doing so. And maybe that says something about how Marjani perceives her home country, how the home country is Iran is at this point in time. But there's an implication I've put here, 1 and 2 for want of a better way of putting it, that they relate to the first panel and the second panel. On the first, it looks as though she's trapped. Although she's leaving, it looks as if she's kind of trapped between these two worlds. And then on the second panel, she's waving goodbye. She's ready to leave her past behind. And maybe that's something to do with that identity shift. She's changed her perception of her father, who was presented with this darkened face, because maybe she still viewed all men as equally bad, and yet he's there kind of with an elongated, as in a stretched out arm, supporting the wife, her mother, as though it's such a difficult task and you have to be flexible. But again, that's more about the father than Marjane. But what's interesting is we have the addition of the third character. We have the awareness of her grandmother's reality, that her grandmother, you know, she's aware that she's not going to see her again, and I think that's kind of reinforced by the tears that emanate there, which she's using. Now, the next idea that I want us to look at, and I want you to try and answer this question, is looking at the role of commercialism. And I've deliberately picked out 3 different sections. And the first one is where they go to the supermarket and they say that, you know, the shelves are going to be empty. So there is a parallel later on. But what I want you to look at here is the way in which, if we're looking at the cyclical element of this, she's a child, and therefore she's struggling to understand, because in the top right panel here, she doesn't understand what they're saying. So there's like a childlike naivety, and this kind of reinforces that unreliability of Marjani herself as a narrator, because how can she possibly know all of these things when she didn't necessarily understand them at the time? So maybe she reflects upon it now and she understands it, but she's writing it now and she still doesn't write it as though she understands what they say. So maybe there's this feeling of being distanced from her childhood and distanced from um, what she experienced as a child here. So the reason why I'm showing you this next panel is very simply, if you look at the top left and top right, the head that's kind of split into two, which is perhaps suggesting there's like a conflict in your mind of doing the right thing, doing the wrong thing, but also it's very childlike. And I just want to highlight how that is similar to later on, where she's in Austria and she goes to this well-stocked store and she acts in this way that she says, you know, I went shopping like a woman, and as she's going, her scarf is behind her, almost like a replication of the veil. And I've talked about that on a previous video, but basically this idea is that she's pretending to be mature. And we've all been in that situation where you pretend to be more mature than you actually are, and yet her actions here give this away. And there's this feeling in this panel that she's struggling with identity. She refers to I headed to the first island I headed for was the one with scented detergents, and then says we couldn't find them in Iran anymore. And who's she talking about? Is she talking about we as a country, we as a family, we as herself? It's this idea that she's, and this is such a pervasive, as in it's so ingrained throughout the whole thing. She struggles with identity throughout the entire text. So I want you to go back and look at this question, maybe looking at these panels, maybe seeing if you can find other examples. The chapter called Kim Wilde is interesting because, for a start, it's not called the, not that all of them are, but it's interesting, and it plays into this idea of like the influence of Americanization, Western influences, and to what extent is that playing a role, and to what extent is that perhaps seen as positive or negative in this text. Okay, and that is pretty much it. And it's a very short video this time, but it is something that where I want you to try and respond to the questions. And I hope you enjoyed watching. Please give me feedback if you really enjoyed it. I'd love it if you shared with other people you think might enjoy this, and just let me know what you think down in the comments below. Thank you. Bye-bye.